Okay, for this week's shooting assignment, you are concentrating on objects or subjects that move. Okay, so you can be looking, if it's really windy, at flags, at grasses, at trees, at sporting events, um, any kind of different subject matter as long as it's moving. So you may need to cause that movement, or you may need to search out places where you can find people and things that are moving. Okay, so that's what we're going to be concentrating on. That is involving your shutter speed settings. The other thing I want to talk to you guys today in this presentation is about composition. All right, so I'll mention the shutter speeds and the compositions when we're looking at these photographs that are about movement. So slower shutter speeds, anything below 1/25th of a second down to the full 30 seconds is considered a slow shutter speed. Okay, now depending upon how bright it is outside and how fast your subjects are moving, you can get various degrees of that movement. And in this image, I'm sorry, the resolution is not as great as it is. You can see the people, the photographer standing on out on a balcony or a rooftop, something that's a higher perspective, shooting down on the street activity. And even some of the people standing still are not standing still. They're moving around, they're breathing, they're shifting their weight, all of that stuff. But then also along the street, we see, I see probably headlights, car lights. Some of it looks like fire to me down here, but that just could be the uneven roads. Okay, this is telling me it's a longer exposure. It took, from here to there to record that light. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I would imagine it's like a 15th of a second, an eighth of a second, a quarter of a second, somewhere down in that slow. Okay. A half a second or a whole second. You may have to experiment with all of those to get varying degrees of movement. For sure, you will need a tripod. A tripod is a must to achieve this type of movement. Here's another clear image of Big Ben. This was obviously taken, they're doing some repairs now. But here we've got a bus going by. We can see by the height of it, by the color of it, and I can kind of see its ghost image back here. But this is an exposure. It's a large depth of field because it looks like everything's pretty in focus. But the shutter was long enough to record these interior lights and advertising lights, and headlights of the bus and other cars that may be passing. Again, this is a longer exposure time, somewhere again around a quarter of a second, a half a second, a full second. One thing I will say about this composition is I really love the placement of where the bus is beginning. Kind of all these lines here kind of all draw our attention back to this space. And it's not centered. It's over kind of in this area, activating that space. Lines, whether they're real or virtual, are great for leading lines, is what we call them. And it's kind of all going back to the bus so we can see the shape of it. But it's also activating all of this area that would just be blue sky. And not that that wouldn't be pretty, because that blue is very spectacular, but these are just adding in a new element. So it's not just dead space, it's really activating that whole space. And if you think about the center of this composition, which is right here, there's really not anything, one specific thing here. So this photographer is utilizing the entire frame to make this composition. So again, when you're out there shooting, think about using, we call it the thirds. So if we were to divide this space in thirds here, whoops, my line was kind of crazy that way, and then horizontally here and up here, that's where you'd want to place your objects, your subject matter, on the thirds. That's just a range. Like here we can see it's kind of even more into the quarters if we were to divide it in quarters, but at least it's not in the center, right? So moving things around your frame, that will allow you to use the space more dramatically. And this, by the same photographer, is doing the same thing. Again, this telephone booth is on the third on the left, right? So again, if we were to divide this space into thirds, it'd be right along here, and then somewhere in here, here, and here. My only problem is this horizon line is pretty centered. But at least it's not an obvious horizon line because we've got all these light trails happening. And you can see some of the white lights are really overblown. There's no detail in them, but still this photo looks really super cool. And I love, you can see just the number of the bus right there. That was turned out really sharp. So again, you're going to have to kind of experiment, and you may have to stand there for a while waiting for another bus to come by. You know, an experiment may take you an hour or so, but I think this and the previous photograph proved that as you're waiting or as you're experimenting, you're going to end up with some really neat photographs. Photography does take a little bit of effort, a little bit of thought, and definitely time. But love this. So longer exposure shows movement. Now this is something we can easily take in our region. And this also is showing a long shutter speed. What we're seeing here is a large depth of field because everything, you know, seems really sharp back there. Everything in the foreground is sharp, even these little bubbles. But what's not sharp, this is the water coming in and going back. So that movement of coming up and then back is blurry. So how long does that take? We've all been out at the beach. Half a second? Less than that? I'm not sure. You know, so if you're shooting on the TV or the S, you can very easily experiment. And you can be sitting there as the sun is rising for 15-20 minutes experimenting with this. Now, as the sun rises and it gets brighter, it's going to be harder to stop the action because there's just so much light. You know, your exposures will be too bright. This is the waterfall effect, this soft, angel-like feeling. This is a long exposure time. This has also got a really dramatic vignette, which is when they darken the edges. I think it's went a little bit overdone in this image. But the glow from the waterfalls is very attractive. And a lot of people like to achieve this quality. So you need a tripod, and you need to experiment with the longer times. I would probably say maybe a second to 3. Again, depending upon your light quality and when you're shooting this, you know, you might be limited. You might have to go earlier in the morning or later. This is an example of panning. Again, your camera's moving at the same speed as the subject. This is typically a slower shutter speed. It can be, you know, 1/25th, 1/60th, you know, up there. You know, you could even, depending on the lighting, you could try this at 250th of a second. It might not show the movement as much, but you just have to experiment, unfortunately, with this. Now, Clark Little is a very famous beach photographer. Well, really, he's photographing the waves, the curl of the waves, the way that the time of day and the scenery impacts the water as it's curling on itself. And he's using very fast shutter speeds. He also has a waterproof camera, and he's getting plummeted every time he's taking a picture. And there's a lot written about him. He's become quite the famous photographer with this series of work. But it's really beautiful, right? And this wave, I mean, capturing it before it crashes in on itself, we're talking fractions of a second. And he has to shoot for a long time and get beat up by these waves because he's right in the middle of them over and over again until he gets the image. Talk about, you know, paying a price for your artwork. Look at all that foam there, but look at those beautiful colors. You know, you don't see colors like that in nature anywhere else, really. And they're just really kind of beautiful. I like this one. Just look at the water, looks like glass, right? But then it's these little frozen um, droplets and the spread of the water that's really kind of awesome. Just beautiful, beautiful work. So that's Clark Little. Now these are some other images I found online that can be done with fast shutter speed. So this is, just someone running and jumping and stopping that action. You're going to be up there above 500th of a second, 1,000th of a second to freeze frame this. Love this idea. One of those paint bombs literally like thrown in someone's face. Maybe not the nicest thing to do, but makes for a really cool photograph. If you have a clear plastic jug and you can get a piece of mat board or cardboard that's black, and you can set something like this up, you can have a friend drop the items into the water and you can take pictures of them. So kind of fun way to experiment with time and stop action. Sports photography, all about stop action. And if you're a skier, wouldn't you love to have a picture of yourself like this? I mean, I know I would in my younger days. But again, we know it's a very fast shutter speed because they're flying over us. So for this assignment, and the composition, again, the placement of the object is not directly in the center, right? The horizon line is way down there, but we do have the mountains kind of underneath the third. And the skier is placed, closer to the right third than in the center. So sometimes it gets confusing if you're looking through your camera and you're seeing these little boxes that surround the center of your viewfinder. That's not a place object here thing. That's actually your light meter. So for this assignment, let's really start shooting, thinking about our compositions. Okay? All right. I'll talk to you next week about the next assignment.